Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. I have with me today a returning guest. So this is my good friend Jessica Parker, who was on my Systems Thinking podcast. But I'm bringing her back because she is actually a builder in the AI space and education. And so without further ado, Jessica, welcome back. The opening question that I want to ask is, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you're seeing out there around generative AI as it pertains to education?
Yeah, so thank you, David, for having me back. I feel like a lot has changed since we last spoke. I think it was earlier this year. And I think what's interesting is since I launched my company in November, we build generative AI tools for academic researchers, emerging and experienced academic researchers. And something that I continue to notice as a major misconception is just a lack of understanding of how large language models work, which leads to a host of other misconceptions. So I'll give you an example. One of the questions that we get asked all the time is, do Moxie's AI tools produce content that can be picked up by AI detectors? So there's questions about AI detectors. There's questions about plagiarism, because there's a misconception that large language models pull complete sentences or phrases from a single source, so therefore it would lead to plagiarism. And so a lot of our work just continues to be focused on explaining how large language models work, what it means to have a predictive algorithm, how vector databases work. And then I feel like as academics start to understand that, their questions shift. They focus less on this idea of plagiarism. They shift away from the misconception that all these tools do are generate content. They can do much more than just generate. And that all just, I think, stems from a misconception about how they actually work, like the core mechanisms of how large language models work.
That makes total sense. And of course, having been in the space for a while, that's kind of where the bread and butter of where my channel started, just saying like, hey, like, yes, it's an autocomplete engine, but that's also just, I don't want to say like naive, but that's like the entry level description as to what it does. It does generate content. But so let's kind of expand that. Tell me a little bit about what you're building, because you've got a startup in the AI space. I still get lots of questions like, what kind of startup should I build? But let's like focus on like what is the problem that you're solving, because you also came from research and academia, which I think is probably a little less common in this space.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a non-technical founder. I am a textbook academic in the sense that I worked in higher ed. I was a research director. I still teach. I supervise doc students. But I started a consulting business about 8 years ago. And a common problem that I've had in that business is just the ability to scale the support that we provide to graduate students. Graduate students are often writing very long documents, 40 plus page lit reviews. My ratio of students to teacher was 26-1 the first year I taught. And so I was like, imagine providing 26 students high quality feedback as often as they need it on documents that are 40 plus pages in a semester. So at the most basic level, the problem that I wanted to solve when I started using generative AI and I saw its potential was just scaling some of that one-to-one feedback and support. So I started started using an application layer by Mind Studio. And I initially just started playing around with this idea of, okay, if I build a chatbot and I write a prompt and I do some custom input variables, like how well can it use a rubric that I provide to provide feedback to a student on a piece of written text? And what I learned was that it was really good at it. Like the more context I gave it and the clearer the instructions were, it did it pretty well. And so I started using those tools with my doc students right away. I started asking them to use the tools for formative feedback. And I immediately just saw a potential business model there that could complement what my consulting business does. But now we're doing really interesting things. Like we just partnered with a professor at Iowa State University that has he has a large corpus of data, and we're building a RAG system for him. We're trying to make it easier for him to reach students in parts of the world where they want to access his knowledge, but maybe can't afford to take a class with him or meet with him one-on-one. And so we're building this like really interesting AI tool that leverages RAG in order to help teach students about his field of study in a way that he wouldn't normally be able to give them access to that work. So yeah.
That's excellent. So to unpack, like, it sounds like there's a couple of avenues that you're finding ways to generate value. Because one, I mean, every teacher, every educator at every level from primary to, secondary and post-secondary that I've ever talked to, it is a matter of, like, why are we grading? And, sometimes providing feedback is really what the point of grading is. But when you're overloaded in terms of, student to teacher ratio, you can't provide the high quality feedback. And so this is something that you and I have talked about in the past. But from a business standpoint, because there's a couple of questions that I want to unpack. One is like, what is the dollars and cents of that business model? But also just like, what other kind of KPI or metrics can you see, like, with the quality of increased quality of feedback? I know that you and I have mentioned or discussed before, like, the students get a lot more out of it. So how do you see that, like, subjectively or objectively? How do you measure that improvement? And then how do you monetize that improvement?
Yeah, so I'll start with what I was doing with my students, which wasn't about monetizing, but those same sort of metrics still apply on the business side. So when I first started implementing these tools with my students, it's a small N. I actually have a study coming out on this work soon, but it was a group of 8 students. And first, I just required them to use the AI tools for formative feedback twice. And I just explained to them, the goal is for you to try to close the gap on your own. And the simplest way to explain it to the students, which I was thinking was like, I should start seeing improvements earlier in the semester, because the AI tool is designed to reinforce learning. And so they're being constantly reinforced, those same concepts that they're learning in class from the AI tool, and start seeing higher summative assessment scores. And that's what I started seeing with those students. These students in particular were in an academic writing class. And these students came to me with very little knowledge of many academic writing concepts around precision, anthropomorphism. And typically with students who are just learning academic writing, I really don't start to see the gains until later in the semester. And so that was one of the first measures, is do I start seeing those gains sooner? And a lot of this was anecdotal or qualitative evidence because it was such a small N. But from the perspective of our clients, which we have around 4,000 users at Moxie, and we partner with several universities, the feedback that we get from our users and our faculty typically revolve around, like, we don't focus a lot on speed. I just find that the argument around speed and efficiency is not as applicable in this case. It's really more about the student making progress without getting stalled. And so what's really common with grad students is they get to that independent research stage and they get stuck. And oftentimes they'll spend years just stuck in that proposal writing stage. So at the most basic level, as a measure of success, is what we're talking to our university partners about, is like, when we deploy our tools with students who are sort of stuck, they haven't been making progress, are they actually moving forward and able to move to that next stage? And we are seeing evidence of that. And so tracking that student progress from course to course, or trying to determine if they've been stuck in a course and then they could move on. Also, just the amount of revisions required. I was just talking to a client yesterday who typically goes through around 7 rounds of revisions with a faculty member, with her supervisor. And she says since she started using our AI tools, which are embedded within the course that she's taking at her university, she's been going through revisions in like 2 rounds of revisions. So those are the sort of metrics we're looking at right now until we can do a larger scale study. But just gathering that data from customers indicates that they're moving through the process not just more efficiently, but they're able to reduce those rounds of revision on these like really long documents that often take months to revise.
Excellent. That actually reminds me, just to add a little bit of flavor for the audience, is as a fiction writer, as a novel writer, certainly that getting unstuck is is a key thing, whether you're just brainstorming, but also as the context windows have gotten larger and you can put an entire manuscript into these chatbots and just ask, like, what am I missing? Like, summarize this character's journey, or give me some ideas, and then you're back to the drawing board, or back to the writing desk, as it were. There's a whole bunch of directions that I could think of taking the conversation from here. So obviously, getting the data, and it sounds like one of the primary value adds is not necessarily, like you said, it's not necessarily speed, but it's overcoming obstacles and keeping the process going. Could you characterize, like, which aspects? Is it the tight feedback loops? Is it the quality of the feedback that the AI is providing? Like, what is the magic there, or maybe not magic, but what is the mechanism there that is helping to get students unstuck and
Mm-hmm.
therefore, ultimately increasing the quality of education that they're getting?
Yeah, I think there's several layers to it. I'll just first touch on like the psychological aspect of it. So, as a student, like I remember being a graduate student, there were questions I didn't want to ask my professor that maybe I would be more inclined to ask a peer because it's like admitting what I don't know. There's some imposter syndrome there. And so, one aspect of it is like being able to get feedback at any given time from a tool, especially for our university partners, that you know that your professor has reviewed and approved. So, there's that trust. And you're able to ask questions that you wouldn't normally ask. So, that's one aspect of it. The next layer is in doing so, the students are able to better see their blind spots and their weaknesses. And then they're more likely to be positioned to go to the professor with more specific questions about what they're struggling with because their awareness has evolved of what those sort of strengths and weaknesses are in their work. Another layer of it is around just the speed of getting feedback and the quality of it. That's the more obvious aspect. But there's also these elements that we're starting to see, not just in my research, but also in emerging research, which is this idea of like learner agency, where the student feels more in control because they're able to get feedback as often as they want and try to implement it on their own. And then when they go to the professor, they feel more in control because they've already tried to close that gap and they're able to ask more targeted questions and ask for more targeted guidance. And I like to give the basic example of it is so common for me to get a paper from a student and I was just like, can you give me feedback on this? And the very first thing I tell them is like, you have to tell me what you're struggling with. I'm not just going to pre-grade this entire paper. Whereas now my students using these tools, because I built them to give them feedback in very specific ways, they come to me and they're like, I can't refine my PICO question. Like the intervention and the comparison just aren't lining up. So they're much more targeted with what they're asking for, which helps me give them better, more timely feedback as well. Trying to think if there's anything else I'm leaving out. Those are the major buckets, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of things. Real quick question is, what is a PICO question for any non-academics?
Yeah. So it's commonly used in healthcare where we get the students to focus on identifying the P as the population, the I is the intervention, the C is the comparison. So typically in healthcare, you're comparing an intervention group and a comparison group, and then the O is the outcome.
Got it.
So it's part of
Yep.
evidence-based practice.
And so I want to talk a little bit more about like education theory, because one thing that I've always told people when they say like, what kind of startup should I build or join or whatever, is I say, take your subject matter expertise that you already have. Because artificial intelligence has given some people, the confidence to break into a domain that they're not familiar with already. But the subject matter expertise that you have with education is very obvious just over a short conversation. And you're able to bring that, talking about concepts like learner agency, which, quick aside, is that learner agency, is that a concept from within the constructivist view of pedagogy?
Yep, I was just about to talk about constructivist learning theory and this idea of more knowledgeable others and zone of proximal development, and yeah, it's all
Excellent.
related.
Yeah. So, and to tie it back to the AI conversation, one of the things that I'm hearing over and over again is that while there are some similarities between the way that humans work and AI works today, it's often the differences. So, for instance, the fact that AI can read a 40-page paper in a few seconds and provide salient feedback, as long as you've got the right, tools to generate that feedback. So, what are you seeing in terms of how is AI figuring into this, this theory of education? Are we heading towards Bloom's mastery learning or mastery teaching techniques, and how is it augmenting, how is it adding, here's the most salient question, how is it adding new tools to your toolbox rather than just replacing humans out there?
Oh, that's an interesting way to think about it. New tools. Well, I'll use the example, I like to talk about examples. An example of a student who's conducting a literature review. A literature review is the cornerstone of any academic research, whether you're an emerging or an experienced researcher. So when I think about tools available, so typically when you conduct a literature review, we would use tools available would be a university library database and Google Scholar, which both use like keyword search to find articles that are relevant based on the keywords that you provide in the search strings that you provide. And then you use other tools like a reference management software. You use your Microsoft Word processing. You use Grammarly to check for accuracy in your language. And these are common tools that we've been using for a while. But now we have these really incredible AI search engines like Elicit and Cite, Consensus, Litmaps, where you can instantly identify literature gaps, which from an experienced researcher, is incredibly helpful because I already have an idea. I'm an expert in my field. And so sometimes it's just validating that idea and then I can move on. I'm not going to ruminate on, am I getting this right? Am I thinking about it correctly? It like validates my idea, so I'm able to move on. But from a student who is really struggling with like synthesis and identifying those gaps, to be able to instantly populate a table as a starting point not only shaves off a ton of time, which again, I try not to focus too much on speed because I don't think that's a great sort of goal to have as a researcher, but it saves time. And then I tell my students, instead of, don't think of it as you're writing a lit review faster, but maybe the time that you would have spent front loading, building out your own manual literature matrix where you're populating it on your own. Maybe that shaves off 10 hours. Now spend that time actually interrogating the literature and critiquing it. Whereas they tend to have sort of skip that step. They tend to not spend time critiquing. So it's like, instead of it speeding things up, I talk about AI just shifting your time. Like you're not necessarily skipping the step, but the time you would have spent here is now able to shift somewhere else. And so I have my students focus on that critique element of conducting a lit review. And so having those tools available, I think, is giving them a better bird's eye view of the literature faster. So then they can choose then more quickly, like where they want to go concentrate their efforts. Whereas a lot more time before would have just been spent gathering the actual data and populating it in a matrix. So I think the literature search engines that are coming about with AI are an incredible tool that we have available. And not even just from a research perspective, like the average person could use these tools. A lot of them have a free option where if you just want to know if there's evidence to back up a claim that you're seeing on the internet, actually getting like evidence-based answers to your questions really quickly, and you can actually go directly to the source. So this idea of making like evidence-based decisions and getting a better bird's eye view of all of the literature on a specific topic is now like at the touch of our fingertips.
Yeah, that's actually, that particular model is something that I'm seeing multiple use cases for in multiple tools. So the most popular one is Perplexity. Perplexity, for anyone in the audience who hasn't seen it or used it yet, is basically the next generation search engine.
Yeah.
So it adds, it uses conventional search engine on the back end, but then it'll read up to several dozen pages for you and then provide you a good analysis of the information. And it will even do multiple steps too, depending on how complex your query is. And then another tool that's more domain specific is Case Text, and Case Text is a tool, does very similar thing. It looks up case law for lawyers, and some of my lawyer friends are a big fan of Case Text. And rather than, this is where I want to drill in, is because rather than, yes, it does save you time and mental energy because it's offloading like a low resource, but rather tedious task. But really, like, because what a lot of people are telling me is that AI tools are removing the drudgery so that you can spend more time on the higher order tasks that are going to be the more valuable tasks, or the more like human-centric tasks. So how would you characterize it? Because yes, like providing good feedback, that does save the educator some time, accelerating the literature review. But again, as you've said, it's not necessarily time. So how would you characterize it? Because the way that I've characterized it is it's a form of cognitive offload, or like a form of delegating, right?
Yeah, cognitive offloading, I think, is a good way to describe it, because that's exactly, going back to the lit review example, it's shifting your time. I can't remember who I heard characterized that way, because most people just talk about saving time. But I think what I'm noticing, at least for myself, is it's not like I'm getting back more hours in my day. That's just who I am. I'm just going to work. But the way I'm spending my time has definitely changed. So my time has shifted more from the lit review, because I still do research. I'm not spending 4 hours populating a literature matrix manually. Now I'm taking that time and I'm shifting it to taking a deeper dive into those individual studies and strengthening my argument and exploring different perspectives. So again, it's this time shifting and the cognitive offloading, I think, is a huge benefit of that. But I think what's challenging is like the way I use AI tools with my students at the doctoral level is not going to be the same way that like a third grade teacher uses an AI tool with a student, if at all. I think in the K through 12 space, it's a much different, more difficult conversation about how we think about AI in children. But at the end of the education pipeline, which is where I live, I'm mostly working with emerging experts or experts. And I think that end of the pipeline is really perfectly positioned for this cognitive offloading.
So that's really interesting because maybe perhaps intuitively or naively, you might assume that because these tools are not yet at the level of, PhD researchers, they've kind of been characterized as, a smart high schooler or an intern level. Mm-hmm. But the fact, like what you just said, is rather profound, that it's actually what you're doing is you're finding a lot of utility at the end of the educational pipeline. And having spoken to many people trying to position AI earlier in the pipeline, it actually almost seems like it's harder to do. So that's a really interesting kind of paradox. I don't know. Is there any more insight that you want to unpack from that observation?
Yeah, I was just talking to Kimberly about this in detail yesterday because we are working with a lot of faculty to help them integrate AI into their courses. And it's challenging because there's no one size fits all approach. I'm actually pretty happy to be at this end of the pipeline. I think it's a lot easier than thinking about like a child's brain development and cognitive development and what that means to interact with an AI tool. But to answer your question, just in the most simplest way possible, I think because generative AI right now, the output is not 100% accurate. Until they are, I think it's problematic to expect a student or just anyone who doesn't know how to do whatever you're asking the AI to do on your own to use it in that way. So I'll go back to an example of what Kimberly and I talked about yesterday, which was around research design. So if you're in your first year of a doctoral program or a master's degree program, and you're just being exposed to different research methodologies and research designs, and you're learning about how language is such an important cornerstone of all of it. So the language used in a research question is directly related to your research methodology and design. Like if I use the word association in my research question, then that is signaling to the reader that I'm doing a quant study and that I'm probably looking at a relationship between variables. And just that one word can make a huge difference. And so for someone who doesn't know that, they are not in a good position to interrogate the output and notice that something's wrong with it. And so I wouldn't want a student who hasn't yet done that before or hasn't gained that knowledge and understanding to use the tool in that way. And so it's this really, I think, thoughtful integration where you consider, well, what are the learning outcomes? So if the student is expected to learn this and have knowledge recall and be able to apply it on their own, then I don't want them to collaborate with AI to do that task. But later in the semester or later in their coursework, when they've already demonstrated that they have that knowledge and they can apply it, then I think they're perfectly fine to collaborate with AI because they can acknowledge whenever the output is incorrect.
Makes sense. And also for some context for the audience, Kimberly is your co-founder,
Yes.
correct?
Yes,
Yep.
she's my co-founder at Moxie. Yeah.
So one thing that's occurring to me, I was just jotting down some notes as you were talking, it almost seems like the further along or the higher up in Bloom's taxonomy someone is, the better able they are to use AI tools. Is that kind of a fair characterization, just like TLDR?
Yeah, exactly. And especially when you're using it to collaborate, like when you're co-creating with AI, I think you're much better positioned if you're already an expert in that space. So when I teach my students to use it, if they're early in their coursework, it's not really about collaboration. They're not co-creating with it versus the students who are later in their coursework or faculty who are already experts.
Makes sense. Well, it's like, Grammarly is there for people who already have a pretty good grasp of language, but it's not going to teach you the rudiments of good fiction or the rudiments of good journalism.
Yeah.
So you need to have a solid foundation. So I want to pivot to a little bit more, and this I do this in all of my podcast interviews lately. I want to focus a little bit more abstractly or speculative. So, and I get this question a lot, like, what is the purpose of education in the long run? Obviously, in the short term, humans are still, we're the apex predator on the planet. We have the biggest brains, but in the long run, and I want to get your unfiltered opinion or view on like where does education fit in 10, 20 years from now?
10, 20 years from now. Well, it's interesting, David, because I've listened to your episodes on like post-labor economics, so I think that's slightly, I'm a little biased because I do see a world where we are able to, especially as these AI models get better and better, there's going to be more opportunity for cognitive offloading. Companies are going, I mean, I hate to say it, but I do think education or otherwise, jobs will be lost and hopefully ultimately replaced by AI. So when I think about your post-labor economics theory, I do agree that we could be moving toward like a more leisurely class and like liberal education, I think will come back. In the space of education that I'm most involved with, it's around professional education. So it's around technical degrees, professional degrees. It'll be interesting to see how that changes because I'm very much embedded like in the knowledge economy. So I have concerns about how that might shift over time. Um, but I don't know. I'm really not sure. We talked about this on our first episode a bit, where we talked about like liberal education versus preparing students for the workforce or being, contributors to society. And I go back and forth because ultimately, I mean, we all make meaning out of experience. And my entire purpose of my education was I needed to be able to financially support myself. And so I deliberately chose a degree that would allow me to immediately go into the workforce and make pretty good money and pay back my student loans. So workforce preparation is what immediately comes to mind for me.
Right. Well, and I guess the kind of the answer is in the uncertainty is what are the incentives in the future? And I think that that's probably the primary signal to pay attention to, because if the economic landscape changes, then the incentives for getting an education will also change in terms of like what is going back to what you're talking about earlier, like what is the desired outcome that you're looking for, that you're measuring. One thing that you said is like, I don't remember exactly how you worded it, but like someone's contribution to society or the value that they add might also change in terms of, okay, if post-labor economics does become true. And so for anyone in the audience who hasn't heard this term yet, it's basically what I use to describe a potential future economic paradigm where human labor is no longer the primary driver of GDP, where capital invested in AI and robots is the primary driver of GDP, which decouples the economy from human activity. So if that becomes the case, which it may or may not, depending on time horizon, the question then becomes like, what do we do to add value to ourselves, to society, and those sorts of things. And so you kind of alluded to one possibility being more liberal arts education, studying the humanities, rhetoric, history, politics, psychology, those sorts of things is one possibility. But in the near term, so this is another question that I get. In the near term, people ask me like, what should I study? Because they don't want if they invest a couple of years into technical education, they don't want it to be obsolete immediately. And so one thing that I always tell people is the most durable skill set that they can get is people skills. Well, what's your take on like near term, like the next 5 to 10 years in terms of education? What's going to be of maximum utility for people that are looking to kind of follow in your footsteps? Like, okay, I need to make ends meet.
Yeah, I need to make ends meet. Yeah, if I had a child who was like going off to college right now, I would probably say I've always had I come from a healthcare background, and I think regardless, healthcare is always going to be needed. As long as there's humans, we need healthcare, we need housing. So I feel like there's knowns that humans are always going to need. Now, how that shifts and how things are delivered, who knows? But I think there's always safety in going toward a healthcare degree, and that's where I came from. And I've never had a problem finding a job, whether it be through teaching or through working in healthcare, or through doing healthcare research. And I just have fallen in love with technology. So I know that this is not going to be popular, but I do feel like technology is, at least for my lifetime, always been such a big part of my life. But the more I learn about AI and try to understand how large language models work and how they can be leveraged, not only do I learn about technology, but learning about language. And as humans, language is a tool. It's how we communicate everything. And so in some ways, it's like made me a better communicator. because it's forced me to interrogate language in new ways in order to understand how these models work and how to leverage them in ways that, are productive for me. And so I don't know. I think that there's something to be said for becoming an expert and learning how to leverage AI in ways that maybe the next person is just not going to make that investment in.
Absolutely. One thing that occurs to me is because and this has been a truism for the entire time that I've been in technology, which is all technical skills have a very short shelf life. Whatever you learn within 5 years, it's pretty much going to be obsolete, whether it's software or hardware or infrastructure or whatever. But the value, at least from learning in the tech space, is learning how to learn.
Yes.
So what do you think about that? Like, as just a more broad, like maybe that is the new like main principle, is the whole purpose of education is just learning how to use your brain and learning how to learn.
Yeah. And yeah, focusing on critical thinking and problem solving. I mean, these are great skills to have regardless of what field you're in. I do have concerns. I understand why the K through 12 sector is concerned about AI in terms of like, are we just going to totally bypass all critical thinking skills? Because I see markers of issues in critical thinking even at the highest level of education. But yeah, critical thinking and problem solving. I mean, what I teach my doc students from a healthcare perspective are the same things I would want any citizen to know, which is like how to take in information and interrogate it, really think about who's the source, is this biased, and where's this data coming from? Where's this information coming from? And I think we're all guilty of like saying, I read something on the internet, so it must be true. But yeah, when you boil it down to that, I think that's just a good skill set to have. And being open to evolving. I mean, my interest in generative AI came out of like two places because like I said, I'm a non-technical person. I've never really been interested in computer science or any of these things, but it came out of two areas. One was just I was intrigued when I started using ChatGPT-3. It intrigued me, but one of my biggest motivators, the driver, was I honestly saw the potential end of my consulting business, which is my bread and butter. And I thought, this is the future. Like, I need to learn it and understand it if I'm going to be able to pivot my business. And it was through that sort of problem solving lens that I became obsessed with AI and then started an AI company. And I think if people can get used to that, where it's like, looking ahead and thinking strategically and trying to think about how you can pivot your career, because we're talking about careers, based on what's happening, overall in society and the economy, I think is a good skill.
That's a fair point, because when I take a step back, like that was the energy that I was responding to back in 2019, 2020 when I got access to GPT-2 and GPT-3. And I just realized, like, this is a trend that I don't want to miss. And I think that there is a lot of FOMO out there, fear of missing out. I think that's something that you and I have in common, where we saw the writing on the wall and we're like, hey, like, this feels like it presents a potential threat to our livelihood. And a lot of people feel the same out there. So let's as we wind down the conversation, like, let's talk about some of the dark side of all this. Because you mentioned the instigating event was, I saw you posted on LinkedIn about AI detectors, and you're always writing really interesting posts about that. So like, whether it's AI detectors, or plagiarism, you mentioned that at the beginning. You also mentioned, like, you're seeing some evidence of maybe cognitive deficits, in higher ed. And I've certainly heard about this in primary education, but that was largely due to the pandemic, because there are a lot of children that are behind because of that, the developmental delays created by the social isolation and the lack of in-person education. So yeah, let's unpack some of the dark sides of that, whether it's people perceiving a threat to their livelihood, or the people over relying on cognitive shorthand, or offloading too much to AI. So like, what is kind of top of mind in terms of the dark side of all this?
I think there's several things come to mind. One is this is for society as a whole, and I see it in my students and how it's sort of come about in higher ed. But this idea of like instant gratification and convenience and being consumers. So I think all of those are related. And what we've seen in higher ed over time is directly reflected in those sort of attributes of society where students are consumers. Like, I remember just when I was in my master's degree program, they were very upfront. Like, if you don't meet the grades, you're going to be kicked out. I think we lost half of my class the first year. Like, I was terrified. I felt like I had to perform in order to pass. Now I feel like it's very different. Just when I started teaching undergrads, probably 15 years ago, what I immediately noticed, and it was the first time I noticed it, was this idea of a student being a consumer. Like, we have to go through a lot of hoops as faculty to fail a student, even if they legitimately earned a failing grade. And so this idea of higher education being big business and student being consumers, I think is inherently very problematic. So that trend continuing, coupled with the potential to offload too soon to AI for the convenience and for the instant gratification, I think is really, there's a host of potential issues that I think would come from those two things sort of coming together, because it is like this mindset of a student consumer where it's like, hey, I'm paying all this tuition, I'm buying my degree, like, you can't fail me. And this is happening across the board.
Right.
But when I think about these other aspects of the dark side of AI, I start to get concerned. Like, when I saw there was a recent press release where Taylor and Francis sold all of its authors, all of its data, all of its text to Microsoft AI. And without consulting the authors, there's no like royalties going to the authors. It's like this $15 million deal. So on the other side of it, academics are also very worried about, these sort of issues. Like, how can you sell my data without my permission? I mean, if you ask
Right.
me, I'm not surprised that this
Right.
happened. This is publishing. I see, I don't know, just all these sort of issues popping up. And it depends on your role and what role you're playing in higher ed, I think, and how it sort of impacts you. But
Yeah. Well, so that model of, students as consumers,
Mhm.
right? That actually reminds me of a conversation that I had inside my new education community, because I'm getting into teaching and coaching as well. And in my case, the model is because I have, like, there's a parasocial relationship that I have with my audience, and people want to learn from me specifically as a mentor or coach. But one of the things that a community member said was that that he was struggling to ask questions because education had taught him to only answer questions, not ask them. And so one thing that like part of my platform and part of what I'm doing, and maybe this is part of the paradigm shift, is switching people from a passive role to a more active role. My personal theory of life is in many cases people are kind of given a template, right? Go K through 12 and then go to higher ed. Get a family in the suburbs. Get a corporate job and just kind of follow a default path. Versus charting your own path, whether that's choosing an education path, choosing a career path, choosing a lifestyle that better suits you. But I don't know, just I feel like my intuition is telling me that what you were just talking about is that student as consumer model, whether it's from a business perspective, because yes, there is a lot of money in education. I don't know. What do you think about that? Could AI, what was it? Marcus Aurelius said, like, the obstacle becomes the way. So, like, I think it was Marcus Aurelius. Anyways, do you think that AI, because certainly it could make it worse. Technology often makes things worse before it gets better. Just look at the internet. We're still trying to figure out how to use the internet responsibly.
Yeah.
But on the other side of it, once we figure out and figure out how to use AI responsibly and maturely, do you think that we could create a new paradigm around education? Like, what might that paradigm look like in terms of more actively curious students? Especially if the incentive structure is different as well, whether it's from a money perspective or the outcome that you're looking for. I know that was kind of a haphazard question.
Yeah.
but what do you get from that?
No, I think that there's promise there for several reasons, but one that comes up right away is the ability as a student to instantly, like, what AI does really well is it can contextualize and personalize learning based on your interest. And that's like impossible to do as an educator when you have a lot of students. I can't give examples and tailor my teaching materials to every single student and their own personal interest. So I think there's a lot to be said for students who are not normally engaged because they don't see the immediate alignment between what they're learning and what they care about. So to be able to take in that information in a new way where it's highly personalized and individualized, I think there's a host of benefits associated with that. And we see it in one-on-one tutoring. So when you talk about Bloom's taxonomy, I do think it holds promise for um, solving that Two Sigma problem. Sorry, yeah, Two
Yep.
Sigma problem. So um, yeah, I see the potential there. I mean, obviously, I know that there's a lot of risks, but I choose to see that as a benefit, and that's what I focus most of my time on.
Yep. And also for the sake of the audience, let's really quickly unpack Bloom's taxonomy and the Two Sigma problem, because not everyone is going to be an educator
Mm,
or
mm-hmm,
have education and pedagogy.
mm-hmm,
So in your words, real quick, can you tell us what Bloom's taxonomy is and the Two Sigma
mm-hmm.
problem?
Yeah, Bloom's taxonomy is basically how we think about scaffolding learning, where when a student comes in, you first start by just getting them to recall information. So that's how you test their knowledge. And when you think about younger students, we can do this through quizzes. Like, does a student recall the information that you're teaching them? So that's knowledge, all the way up to application. So there's different levels. And in Bloom's, the Two Sigma problem is related to Bloom's, some of the early research that he did on how do we replicate the benefits of one-on-one tutoring in a group setting and with group learning in a classroom, because that's how most students learn. And it was like two standard deviations away from the learning that you see in a group setting is two standard deviations away from the learning that happens one-on-one. And so in education, it's just, there's always been talk about, well, how do we solve Bloom's Two Sigma problem? And it's, well, how do you scale yourself as a faculty member to give every student one-on-one support? And so that's where generative AI comes in, is potentially replicating those benefits of one-on-one without having to have a human there, which is very expensive and resource intensive.
Exactly. Yeah, and of course AI is a long ways off from fully solving that problem, but certainly you're not the first educator that I've spoken with that sees a lot of hope and potential that AI can at least close the gap,
Yeah,
either
yeah.
by empowering educators. So the kind of the model that I tell people is there's kind of three primary groups of stakeholders where you can look at deploying AI.
Mm-hmm.
One is with faculty and educators. Second is with students, like putting tools in the hands of students, which high school students already use ChatGPT, right? They were using it when it first came out to cheat, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So there's students, there's educators, and then there's the parents and the administration.
Mm-hmm.
Are kind of the three primary groups of stakeholders. From your perspective as an entrepreneur in this space, what are you seeing? And I think this will be my last question, unless we open another can of worms. But what are you seeing in terms of different ways that AI, generative AI, or other kinds of AI can be deployed in to serve each of these different groups out there?
Well, I'll use the example of I'll start with a parent. So my partner, I don't have children, but my partner has two children. And I think most parents could probably relate to this, where you have a child coming home and they're doing homework on something that you're no longer familiar with. And so being able to use generative AI to help you understand concepts really quickly and explain it at the level of the student. Like my partner, his daughter is also dyslexic. So he's used generative AI to help him understand how to work with her dyslexia in ways that just would have taken a lot more effort on his part before. So that's just one example of like having that learning happen in the home, even if you don't necessarily know the topic, without having to go through a lot of sort of labor and effort to get there. From a student perspective, it just goes back to what we've been talking about, like being able to have, depending on the level of learner, but for a young student, if you're using GPT-4, like a more knowledgeable other in your home who can teach you about what you're learning about in class. So having a tutor right in the home that's never tired and available 24/7. Or I see, like, I won't speak for Kimberly, but she has a teenage son, and it's funny, they share a ChatGPT account, and she's like, yeah, he asks questions of ChatGPT that he's like would never ask me as his mother, but it's funny because he knows that she can see it. So it's created this like interesting communication pattern between them that I find fascinating. And then as an administrator, this is more around like the monitoring and tracking side of things. So something that we're exploring to help administrators is like using AI to track student progress within and across courses, which helps for a multitude of reasons. So that you can make informed decisions about what's working well within a curriculum or not.
Excellent. Well, Jessica, this has been, as always, a pleasure to talk to you, and
Yeah.
also super informative. Yeah, I just one thing that strikes me is just the importance of that deep knowledge that you bring about education and
Hmm.
pedagogy, and then mixing that with generative AI and exploring all these opportunities.
Yeah.
So, just once again, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experience and insights.
Sure. Thanks for having me, David.